This is Antic, Atari 8-bit podcast.
Particularly with Jack Tramiel, he was willing to give you enough rope to hang yourself. He was not a micromanager. At one point, there were, I think, we had 160 or so collection lawsuits against us in the initial Atari years. I think really happily back on my Commodore times, less so on the Atari days. You know, when you made a computer, made it cheap, shipped it out and sold it, that was perfect for Jack.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Nicholas Lefevre was in-house counsel for Commodore under Jack Tramiel during the time of the Commodore 64. Then he was in-house counsel for Atari after Jack Tramiel bought it. This interview took place April 10, 2015. So I know that you were in-house counsel for both Commodore and Atari.
Correct.
That sounds exciting. Where should we start the story?
Yeah, I don't know. I just listened, for example, to Scott Adams' interview with you, which takes me back because essentially, Colossal Cave and Scott Adams' Adventures were my introduction to computer gaming.
Yeah.
My wife and I used to spend weekends playing Scott Adams' text adventures together and go to our respective offices on Monday, and our co-workers would ask us what we did for the weekend, and they'd say, "Oh my God, what a weekend. We were kidnapped by pirates." Thank God when the snake attacked, we had a mongoose.
You remember the mongoose. Good. Nice. Did your coworkers have any idea what you're talking about?
I explained to them, but it did make for amusing Mondays. But we did so love those.
What computer were you using at home to play those games?
Well, my first game, actually, we used a hookup to the Space Technology Center in Valley Forge at the end of my high school years in 68, 69. But then in Washington, I had a guy who was a computer scientist at Gallaudet, and he had a hookup acoustic modem to a terminal, and we played the Colossal Cave with a teletype machine. So it would print out, you're on a stream. A stream runs down, disappearing into a grate. And so,
right.
So that was my second computer experience. And my first owned computer was a TRS-80. And my second was a Atari 400 with the membrane keyboard, on which I played the Scott Adams Adventures and other things, and started programming by typing basic instructions in from Compute magazine. And then I later upgraded to an Atari 800. So yes, I started actually on Atari computers.
Cool.
And loved them. I actually, Scott Adams reminded me of something called the fourth programming language. Do you remember it?
Sure.
Yeah, and one thing, I'm here with my mother, and I told her about the bumper sticker back then. Scott referred to the odd syntax of fourth.
Mm-hmm.
So some people had bumper stickers that said, "Love fourth, if honk then."
I hadn't seen that. That's clever.
Yeah, it was a great sticker for fourth programmers.
Nice. So
basic, and then fourth, and then 6502 assembler.
So you were doing that. You're doing computer stuff as a hobby, and you were an attorney for work.
Yes, I was at Georgetown Law School, and then became a law clerk to two different federal judges. And I would obsess on my computer programming and jump up at 2 a.m. when I figured out where that bug might be.
Right.
My wife said, "Did I know about this?" When I said yes.
Do that all the time. It's like you wake up, you have like, oh, I know how to get to the key in the grate, or I know how to solve that computer program. Yeah, that problem. Yeah.
Then what happened is during my second year as a law clerk, my judge rode the circuits, which means you can go and sit and hear cases on another federal court of appeals. Mm-hmm. So it so happened he sat on a panel that was taking an appeal from the district court judge where JS&A Industries had been sued by Data Cache because JS&A, if you remember them, they had all these 4-page ads in the New York Times, had stolen the program in ROM for a computer chess playing product. And the district court had held that computer software in ROM was not copyrightable. It was a circuit. It was utilitarian and thus not subject to copyright.
Interesting interpretation. Okay.
So I pleaded with my judge that, this is disastrous. Please let us write that opinion. And so we wrote the opinion that reversed the district court judge below and confirmed that software in ROM was indeed subject to copyright, which of course played into later cases like the Apple computer versus New Jersey one.
Right.
Franklin. Yeah, Apple versus Franklin.
Right.
Yeah,
which is the famous case, I think, where you could run a particular place in memory and it said stolen from Apple computer on the screen.
Yes. So that was important because, the key software was often embedded in ROM. The BIOS, the boot was in ROM. So making sure that was protected was crucial at the time.
Sure. So as a computer geek, you must have been thrilled when you got hired by Commodore?
Yes. Yes.
Tell me how that happened.
I had gone from the courts into a law firm in Washington with the understanding that I would be able to try to develop a computer law practice there. I joined the Computer Law Association when there were 50 members. And they didn't give me that flexibility. So I was disappointed. So I sent my resume out to Commodore, and a couple days later I got a call and they say, well, come on in, our general counsel has just resigned to go to Coleco because of the ColecoVision. So I went up there and interviewed, and they hired me that day.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that was where? What city?
That was in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Jack Tramiel's office was right across from my QB. Mm-hmm. And I could hear the Jack attacks right through the walls.
Lucky you.
Yeah.
So this was, you hired January 1982 or so, according to your resume. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's correct. So, I mean, this was like going to Hollywood for a, somebody wanted to be a movie star. Because I lived on what was going on out there, and in Silicon Valley, and in the computer industry. So this gave me a chance to be a part of it. So very excited.
So tell me some stories about being a corporate counsel at Commodore. Tell me all the stories.
Oh. Well, it was a very exciting time. Obviously, we were doubling in size every year. The Commodore 64 was just coming out. The Commodore didn't have nearly enough software. So one of my principal charters was to go out with a fellow named Sig Hartman. I don't know if you know that name. He was notorious at the time. And make as many software deals as we could. So we went as a team and CE shows, and would just smoke-filled rooms, one deal after another.
With third-party publishers trying to get them to license things for the Commodore?
Publishers. We did a little publishing of our own, so we do it with a publishing deal. But and this is generally software that would go into ROM in the side port of the Commodore 64. And that, included Scott Adams. Actually, I guess we never cut a deal with Scott, because he had his own publishing, but I did get to know him back then. They did do it with Infocom. Joel Berezzinski was the president of Infocom. So many deals. And then silicon deals. We of course owned MOS Technology, and which was the proprietor of the 6502, but people didn't want to be sole sourced for the 6502, so we went and licensed it out. So I did a couple deals to license it out. Memory deals with Most Tech. Well, that's all kinds of deals.
All kinds of deals. Cool.
Yeah.
You'd said in email that an interesting statement. You said people don't often realize that in-house counsel has a ringside seat to much of what happens. So were you just called into general meetings just to sit there and listen and just speak up when you need to, or?
Well, that's you're generally part of the executive management group. So I would participate in those meetings, and particularly with Jack Tramiel. He was willing to give you enough rope to hang yourself. He was not a micromanager. So he empowered those around him at Commodore to just go out and do it. He'd tell you what he wanted done, and you'd do it. And so I would be then the sidekick to the business person responsible for making it happen, and go into all these negotiations. Ultimately, the goal to develop the contract, but a key element of that was, of course, to negotiate it and make sure the contingencies were covered and all that. So most anything that happened at Commodore in those days, all the major transactions, I was involved. Plus, I was comfortable with, and the only lawyer around, comfortable with the engineering side. Not that I had engineering training, but I knew I didn't have to be afraid to ask questions. So the engineers were perfectly comfortable with me, and I was comfortable enough to ask whatever questions I needed to have answered to understand what they were doing.
I've heard again and again that Jack was a fierce businessman, would just like tough to negotiate with, and then once he did, he might not even pay you after you've delivered. Did you see that?
Well, no question, he was a very fierce businessman, and he believed in getting all the information about the other side to he didn't believe the lines that people give in negotiations to fluff up their price. He wanted to know what the supplier's costs were, that sort of thing. So in that sense, yes, he was quite tough, and obviously unafraid, and I think most of the reputation about not being paid, though, comes from the acquisition of Atari. I mean, when we took over Atari, Atari had just lost over $500 million in a year. And they had, the old Atari management had, as you know, gone out of control. The Pac-Man stories, and you also know how much white powder there was floating around that place.
I've heard bits of that, yep.
Yes. And, the company cars, when I got out there, they gave me a Porsche, because there were just so many around old Atari, and we were trying to get rid of them. Anyway, so they had not paid their bills for a long time. Jack Tramiel bought it on the assumption of liabilities, and wanted to put out as little cash as possible. So, admittedly, we made it hard to collect. At one point, there were, I think, we had 160 or so collection lawsuits. Wow. Against us in the initial Atari years.
Did you feel bad about that?
Yes, I did. I mean, and I think ultimately it harmed the company's prospects, because it obviously made it difficult to form the sorts of partnerships that, say, Apple had learned to develop at that time. That really, Jack had tended to be like a bit of a rag merchant in the computer industry. He'd make a product, cost reduce it, get it manufactured as cheaply as possible, and put it out in volume. And then when you're done with that, you make another one. And there was never any issue. You didn't develop in those days necessarily with that philosophy a long-term strategy of software compatibility and the sort of evolutions that became the model of the business in later years. It's hard to be critical of it because people were just finding their way at that time, and you didn't know. I mean, to make a computer and sell it for $200 was $64K. We sold more Commodore 64s than any other computer that had ever been produced to that time in the world.
Yeah.
Introduced, millions of people to computing.
Yeah.
So, well, that's a good thing. But it had some downsides. Trying to squeeze the pennies, particularly in the early days of Atari, and how that hampered the ability to make partnerships that increasingly became essential to sort of a more mature industry. Mm-hmm. When it became, no longer a consumer commodity tchotchke business and became one that required a long-term growth path and so on. One of the things, it's sad, but the fact of the matter is, and I'm a lawyer, our legal system allows businesses to do that. And in a sense, why shouldn't a business, legal standpoint, take advantage of it? Frankly, in a contract dispute, if you don't pay, ultimately, all you're going to end up having to do is pay what you owe. So, it's not an adequate system.
So I see that you were at Commodore till August 1984, and then at Atari in September '84. So when Jack left Commodore and went to Atari, did he just brought you with him? Tell me that story.
There was a little transition. My wife was in Pennsylvania as well, and so and actually Jack was left by himself in January of '84. Mm-hmm. And started assembling as '84 went on, Trammell technology with just a few of the engineers. So I and most had stayed on with Commodore, and Commodore's got its new manager, and Marshall Smith, complete. Didn't know a thing about the computer industry, not a thing.
Wow.
So that was disastrous for Commodore. But this is one of the stories I kind of mentioned. But Marshall Smith had come in. Commodore lacked a next generation design that was satisfactory. So we looked at Amiga as the potential next generation. So in the summer of '84, we went to talk with Amiga about taking a license for the Amiga computer. I went out with a fellow named Martin Chabilsky, and the two of us were negotiating with Amiga. It so happened that Amiga also had a contract, a memorandum of understanding with Atari at the time, and under that agreement, they'd received money from Amiga. Amiga had got money from Atari and given them an option to use their technology. And there was a certain deadline by which Amiga could pay that money back and get it out from its obligations. So we started negotiating a deal that would get Amiga that money and get the technology for ourselves. And then over the weekend, I got to talking with the founder, the CEO of Amiga, and he suggested, why, Nick, are you guys not just buying us? And I said, well, that's something that we really should consider if you're interested. And he said they were. So we started working on a potential acquisition of Amiga. In the meantime, an old friend of mine, Jamie Cook, who had been a friend as a Washington lawyer and had gone to Atari, the legal department at Atari, a couple of years before, and I were going to get together. We had regular litigation between Commodore and Atari over Pac-Man and joysticks and this and that. And Jamie and I would, beat on each other all day and then go out drinking. So we were going to go out drinking that night. And I'm sitting there, and a rumor comes around that Jack might be buying Atari. So I had planned to have dinner with Jamie Cook that night. So I called Jamie and said, "Hey, are we still on for dinner?" And he said, "Well, gee, Nick, I'm sorry. I got to go to New York." So we then knew that the deal was on, that Jack was buying was buying Atari. So at that point, so we continued with the deal. They got the money to pay off the payback Atari and get out from their obligations so that they could do the deal with us, and then we moved on to an acquisition deal. In the meantime, Jack stepped into the shoes of Atari, which had, to his mind, just been ripped off by Commodore. But had taken, this future plan for Atari's evolution away. So, so he sued. So Atari sues Commodore. In the meantime, I decided to leave Commodore and join Atari.
Why did you want to go? Because
Commodore was on its way down a slippery slope. Though the Amigas looked exciting, but the management that was left at Atari did not look good. Commodore, I'm sorry, Commodore did not look good. So I then went and joined Atari, and so there was some comical scenes where I'm being deposed by my the outside lawyer for Atari, who had been my boss at Commodore, had gone over to Atari and become the chief outside general counsel for Atari, and he's deposing me, who's on the other side of this lawsuit, but working for him.
Because you're a former Commodore employee, but
yes,
but now you're working under him.
On the other side, it was a tightrope.
Wow.
Yeah. So
when you talked about, I just want to make sure I have the full story, because you said in July 1984, when we sneaked into Mountain View to steal Amiga from Atari, by that you mean sneaking in to have the secret meeting?
Yes. Right. I think the statutes of limitations are all passed on these events.
You better hope so. Okay, so now you're corporate counsel at Atari, and let's talk about that, because after all, this is an Atari podcast. So, what went on then?
Well, Atari was actually, first first thing I did is that Jack had thought that I had a business head on my shoulders. So, and the only distribution in Canada, which is where Jack had lived at one time, was a toy distributor, Irwin Toy. So he asked me whether I'd like to go. So he wanted a subsidiary for Canada, not a distributor. Mm-hmm. So he asked me to go up and start Atari Canada. So the first thing I did is I moved to Toronto and started putting together Atari Canada. Mm-hmm. Now, and I started doing what a lawyer does, meeting with lawyers, getting all the paperwork, all the infrastructure stuff in order. Whereas Jack had started his business while driving a cab in New York, fixing typewriters at night and delivering them in the trunk of his car. So he didn't think that you really need a lot of infrastructure to start doing the business. Mm-hmm. And so as a consequence, he was not satisfied with me in that role. And I knew, too, I'm not a sales guy, never have been. So to the extent he thought that he needed a guy right at the start who's setting up the new customers for Canada, I wasn't that guy, and I told him so. And just about the same time, he fired me. So he told me I was fired, and I said, all right, well, where are you, Jack? And I'm in New York. I said, I'll be there tomorrow. And so we met, and he had said, well, go to Sunnyvale. We're going to take it public.
Awesome. So you weren't fired. You just changed positions.
Well, I was fired. Yeah, but he didn't offer me the job right off the bat. I had to go to him.
Okay, so now you're in Sunnyvale.
Yes, and with a lot of the old folks, friends from Commodore. Mm-hmm. Some of whom actually had always been, they've been friends, but there'd been a little hiccup in that friendship, in that after, have you heard of Shiraz Shivji, for example? He was the designer of the Commodore 64.
Okay.
And designer of the ST. He's other than Chuck Peddle, he's the father of the Commodore and Atari computers. So Shiraz and a few other engineers had resigned to go to join Jack with Trammell Technology, and one of the engineers with whom they worked came to me and said, these guys who are leaving are photocopying these technical documents and taking them with them. So I had no choice but to go to court and get an order for the all their stock had gone into the truck across the country. So when they finally got to California, mm-hmm. there were marshals there to supervise the unpacking and scrutinize the documents and make sure that there was nothing had been taken, and litigation followed, which Commodore lost. Essentially, they had not taken anything of real substance. The guy actually had told me about it. He was being truthful, but I think he was unhappy that he hadn't been invited along. But anyway, so the core of the new technical team at Atari had already been defendants in a suit that I had initiated.
Thanks.
Yeah, but and then there were a lot of others that I knew, and a lot of good new people too. At Atari, unlike Commodore, Jack had his family. So Jack and Gary and Sam and Leonard would it evolved into a system where most of the decisions were made on Sunday night at the Trammell house. So Atari actually was a lot less fun for the members of the executive team than Commodore had been, because at Commodore, he gave you a rope, you either hung yourself, you didn't. At Commodore, we used to check the phone list every time it came out to see if our names were still on it.
At Atari, you mean?
At Commodore.
Uh-huh.
Because turnover was so rapid, just after Jack, people were getting fired all the time.
Yeah.
So you either survived or you didn't. But Atari was much more micromanaged, and the control was held tightly by the family. And I guess this is going to be on the web. Leonard, Sam, Gary, I'm not trying to be critical here.
You make it sound like the mob. The family's after me. I don't want to upset the family.
No, I mean I'm fond of all three of them, but it was different from Commodore because it really was a family business. Mm-hmm. So, what do you want to know about Commodore? I mean, we Atari. Obviously, we largely abandoned the game business. Mm-hmm. There was a 7200 that was sort of an upgrade, but not a lot of effort put into that. And of course, in 84, 85, the game market had collapsed. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until a few years later that Nintendo came along with a new model, right, and proved that it still existed. And they did, they invented the razor blade model of video game systems that has been in place ever since. But the initial takeover period was a period where you really didn't want to be in focusing on the game business. And so the focus turned to the ST development and the race against Commodore and its Amiga, which we obviously won. Mm-hmm. And for me, a lot of the time was, for those couple of years, was cleaning up. Like I said, there were 160 lawsuits against us. We had a council where assets and liabilities had been divided and split between three entities. Time Warner, Atari Games, and us. Mm-hmm. So and particularly if you're trying to stretch your cash flow, there are lots of ways to say, we're not sure we're responsible for this. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of that time we're dealing with that kind of thing. And then of course came the Federated deal.
Yeah, tell me about that. The Federated group was retail stores, right? Stereo stores and things.
Correct.
What business did Atari have running, selling TVs and stereos?
Well, the Jack has always believed in vertical integration. So when he, at Commodore, he bought MOS for the chips. We had our own LED fab in California at Costa Mesa. We wanted to do everything to drive the cost out, and the same philosophy persisted. And he was not satisfied with the retail presence he was getting, so he thought vertically integrate into the retail space, establish in each federated store a computer center. In part, Gary wanted to run a retail operation, so many felt that was a factor in the decision. So yes, that went forward. At the same time, National Semiconductor was on the market, and we were actually bidding for that. So we had those two big deals going at the same time: National Semi and Federated. Federated deal we closed, and that was not successful. Retail, there's so much junk that is in the inventory and on racks that can be overvalued, and so the assets were not as they were made out to be, and that ended up in a major litigation with some interesting and clever ways to resolve it. A wager that Jack made between himself and the guy who'd owned Federated.
What wager?
Essentially, we said we think that you have overstated the value by X. You say you haven't overstated the value at all. If the value has been overstated by X divided by 2 or more, then you, out of your selling dollars on selling this to us, have to pay us back this difference. So that was the wager that we reached to allow the deal to go to a close. Otherwise, we're going to back out of the deal, and it would have been litigation. But with that wager, we went and closed the deal, and then got the auditors in and went through an unbelievable disputes over that. Ultimately, the founder of Federated tried to back out of the wager, but lost.
You must have felt, in some ways, some serious job security with all this litigation going on.
Well, I've never been a litigator. I've just always supervised litigation and hired litigators. But yes, there was some very, very long days in Silicon Valley and long weekends. Jack always believed in keeping very lean and mean, and we were very lean and mean, which meant that you worked all the time.
In the early days of Atari, I know there was a lot of work and a lot of play, but I think under Jack, there was no play, there was no hot tubs, there was no cocaine. It was
no. It was Jack, tough, mean, and we had to be tough with others as well. So I think really happily back on my Commodore times, less so on the Atari days.
Interesting. Even though you're working for the same guy, really.
Yes, even though it's the same guy.
So what changed? Was it just the amount of power he had?
It was in part the circumstances of having to take over a business that had been so badly run. Secondly, it was, and there was an evolving business model that Jack was not well adapted to. When you made a computer, made it cheap, shipped it out and sold it, that was perfect for Jack. Mm-hmm. When you needed to form alliances with, all the software world and plan sort of long-term alliances, that was not Jack's way of doing things. And then finally, the fact that the somewhat insular management of Atari as opposed to Commodore, because of the family dynamics, bringing decision making into the family.
As corporate counsel, did you ever have to were you thinking about piracy? I know you're dealing with other corporation stuff. Were you ever thinking about the small level people who were copying software?
Yeah, I had people with importing VCSs into Los Angeles, and I had private investigators going around. We had a van. I went with them that had equipment to listen to what went on in the house with directional microphones, and find out and find all the. In fact, I even went as a PI myself, knocking on doors, pretending to be a census taker. so yeah, that sort of stuff was all the time. And we worked with the FBI and seizing things and customs, seizing things at the border. There's just a million things that you deal with in these things. We could go on forever with, the classic patent battles, the classic copyright battles throughout those years, all the look and feel issues.
Sure.
Myriad licensing, and I stayed in the industry so that afterwards I had my own this practice with Jamie Cook, where we represented Sega and Electronic Arts and Universal Studios and Creative Labs and Broderund and ICOM simulations, and just more of the the software game industry than anybody else at the time. Mm-hmm. And then I did the startup that developed the Nuon media processor that went into the DVD players from Toshiba and Samsung and set-top boxes from Motorola. And that allowed these devices to play video games right on your DVD player or browse the web. Lots of deals then with and then Konami as general counsel.
Back to Atari for a minute. Looking at your resume, it said you dealt with Federated, you dealt with the IPO, and you used some words here. I don't even know what they mean. I don't know if this is interesting or not, so I'm going to ask you. It says Eurodollar debenture offering.
No, it's not very interesting. After the IPO, which is U.S. Initial public offering, right. We also wanted more money, and you could sell debentures, which are debt instruments that are convertible to shares, and you could sell those in Europe for raising good money, and it was a favorable way to raise capital. And Jack has always been a internationalist and always believed in balancing the U.S. market and the European market, because they always felt they were somewhat counter-cyclical. And so that was sort of in keeping with his overall philosophy of being involved. You know, at Commodore, the PET, you know, it did very poorly in the United States, but in Germany, the PETs were the dominant business computer for a time. So he'd learned those lessons about you know, making sure that you didn't invest, you know, weren't relying entirely on a single market.
And the Atari 8-bits were huge in Germany and I think Poland.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we had a great team in Europe.
How did your time at Atari come to an end?
My friend Jamie Cook, who had been in-house counsel to Atari and had been my friend in Washington, D.C., when I came into Atari, he left and started his own practice. And it did very well. So he was representing Sega and a lot of others, and the work was getting overwhelming. So he asked me to join him, and I decided to do that. So we then had a law practice based in Palo Alto. As I said earlier, represented really more of the game industry than any other law firm of any size at that time. The only thing that kept us, we had to tell people we can't represent you because we're representing the other side on the deal. That happened all the time.
Yeah. Can't imagine there were a lot of lawyers that specialized in video games at that early age. So a lot of people were...
No, not then. Of course there are now. But
Sure.
Yeah. Not back then.
What haven't I asked you that I should have?
Well, you want to know about how Commodore filed the very first antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft?
Sure.
Okay. That's a reasonably good story. Back in early 84, we at Commodore felt we needed some business software to become more credible with the C64. So we cut a deal with Microsoft for Multiplan, and at about that same time, we went and bought the design for a luggable PC compatible from Canada called the Bytec. You know, the Bytec Hyperion. Mm-hmm. Anyway, this is about the time of Compaq. So, and Bytec made a PC compatible luggable. So we went and cut a deal and got all that technology to hedge our bets, to make sure if we wanted to be in the PC compatible space. So these two things are running at the same time. When we're and so of course we needed for the Bytec machine an MS-DOS license if we were going to be able to sell a PC compatible.
Sure.
So anyway, we were in Chicago, and we had gotten this big ship. This is a CE show in Chicago. We had this big yacht, huge ship actually, on the waterfront, and we were announcing that we're going to have boatloads of software for the Commodore 64. Don't complain. I know we haven't had much software yet, but we've been at it. We're at boatloads of software. And Sig Hartman is this big voiced character, and I'm standing in the back of the room, and I have the multi-plan agreement with me, hoping that I'm going to get it signed by Microsoft while we're in Chicago. And Jack stands up there and he says, and it's not just game software, or not Jack, Sig. It's not just game software, it's serious software. In fact, we have multi-plan from Microsoft.
Oh, no.
And in keeping with our philosophy, power without the price, it's not going to be $300 or $500 or $400 or $300. We're going to sell it for $99. So I'm back there. I said, holy shit. It's not CERN. So I rushed back to Pennsylvania and got the check cut for the initial payment and sent the agreement signed by our side with the money. The Wall Street Journal next day carries a quote from Bill Gates saying, there's no way that we're going to let anybody sell multiplan for $99. So needless to say, when it got there, he said, "Oh no!" And then by the day after that, he'd been counseled by his lawyers, and it said, "Well, licensees can sell it for whatever they want." But that deal's not done yet, and we still have to go through the processes here. And lo and behold, they said, no deal. Mm. So Jack instructed me to sue them. And so we sued them for a Sherman Act antitrust violation, price monopolization, price fixing, treble damages, $24 million projected, and times 3. So this was like the biggest lawsuit ever against foreign Microsoft, which at the time was trying to go public. Mm-hmm. So they were working on their initial public offering circular, and the last thing you want in that is, in the risk factors section, this honking big liability out there. Sure. Anyway, in the meantime, of course, Steve Ballmer, who was responsible for the OEM deals, is telling me we're not going to the MS-DOS deal for the Bitech. We'll see. We'll talk about it someday. We'll talk about it. Anyway, so I have those things. So at the SoftCon in New Orleans, the first and only one, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were showing off the Lisa computer. And this is my little personal fun story. I go up to talk with Bill Gates, and the two of Bill and Steve are standing next to each other. So I go in between them to get Bill's ear. Somebody snaps a picture of at that time, which then goes out in this promotion for the next year's SoftCon. So it's the three of us, which I then, of course, put on my wall, the three giants of the computer industry. Nice. So anyway, so I talked to Bill, and he said, "Oh, okay, let's talk." He said, "Talk with my friend, with John Shirley." He was the new president at Microsoft, his first CEO. So I met with John Shirley and started working out a deal. And the idea was we'll drop the multi-plan lawsuit if you give us MS-DOS for the Bytec. And as we're working this out, talking about this, I got it at the door. Open the door. There's Bill Gates. Yes, what's going on here? And John and I and Sig was there as well. We're trying to work out something on the getting rid of the lawsuit in exchange for MS-DOS. And Bill goes into one of his fits of anger and curses Jack and everything to do with the Trammels, and I will never deal with it. And we are not even going to talk about MS-DOS until you've dismissed the lawsuit, and then we'll talk, about terms for that. So that was interesting. That was always kind of interesting to me, because essentially he used his monopoly power on MS-DOS to have an antitrust suit dismissed.
Jeez. Which is exactly the point of what you're not supposed to do with antitrust, right?
Exactly.
You said something earlier. You said Jack said sue him, and it sounded like it sounded like maybe that happened a lot. Did you ever just have to, Jack would say sue him, and you just gotta roll your eyes and go, here we go again, we're suing someone for some ridiculous reason?
Yeah, yes. And I would, sometimes I talk about it. But I mean, he didn't file frivolous suits. I mean, this was a legitimate case. I mean, you're not supposed to set the price for your licensees. When you license software, it's theirs to set their own price, and the monopoly that the copyright gives you doesn't get to go there. So, yeah, I can't think of any suit that he had us file that I really felt was improper. Well, I wouldn't have done it. I mean, I couldn't have. Yeah, you really you should talk with Shiraz, because, he's really crucial, and he's just so often not recognized. I mean, I read the Commodore book that says so much about Chuck Peddle. And did you read the Commodore, that Commodore book that came out?
Yeah, the Rise and Fall of Commodore or something.
Yeah, I mean, this is not the Mike Tomczyk one. And anyway, it obviously the author had gotten hold of a few people, including a lot of Chuck Peddle's time. So it focused entirely on a very small set, and he never did get a chance to talk with Jack. So, and he never taught. So, I mean, here's a book about Commodore, and he'd never talked with the guy who designed the Commodore 64.
Wow. Well, this was excellent. This was great. Thank you so very much.
Oh, we're very welcome. Happy to do it. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.